I'm Chad Harvey, and this is AI for the C-Suite, the show for senior leaders who know AI matters and need to figure out what to do about it. Each episode, we dig into what it all actually means for middle market orgs, how it's changing decisions, strategy, leadership, and the very nature of work. Let's get into it. My guest today has spent nearly 3 decades watching how tech actually gets adopted. Not in the slide deck, but in the room on a Tuesday by people who have other things to do. Sean Campbell is the CEO and founder of Cascade Insights, where his team works both sides of this market, helping organizations actually adopt AI and doing deep research for the companies building it. His client list includes Microsoft, Google, and AWS, all the way down to mid-market firms that look a lot like yours. He's also an assistant prof at George Fox University, where he leads AI integration for the MBA program and teaches business students what this all means for careers they haven't even started yet. He writes a newsletter called The Human Side of AI, and if you're really nice, he may be persuadable to take you out on a fishing charter. Lastly, when I asked him what he cares most about in this work, he said, "I have a heart that people don't get run over by this." So that's where we'll start today. Sean Campbell, welcome to AI for the C-Suite.
Thanks for having me on, man.
You bet. All right. Let's start out here with this idea of people not getting run over. And I know when we talked earlier, you started teaching AI at the business school because, in your words, again, you don't want to see folks get flattened. And you're saying that from the perspective of both a business owner, a professor, and a guy who trains corporate teams for a living. So, what does each of those 3 seats show you that the other 2 don't? And what's this all mean?
Yeah, it's a good question. And where that comes from is when my son, who's about to get married this coming Sunday, as we
Mazel tov.
record this. Yeah, exactly. So, first one to get married. So there's all the associated drama. The actual rehearsal dinner is tonight, of all things. Anyway, yeah, so busy weekend for us. But as he goes to George Fox University for his first year there, he was a transfer student. I ended up bumping into the business school faculty, and I said, "Do you guys hire adjuncts?" Because I had been a contributing assistant professor in an MBA program before. I had taught during my master's degree. I always wanted to get back to it. And as my kids were adulting, I'm like, I'd like to get back into this, right? And I should mention that, like all good college students, Josh immediately changed his degree right after getting to school and ended up graduating with a psychology degree. But that's where he met his bride to be, who's also a psych major. So I guess that all worked out. But he's not a business school student. But what it led to me is I ended up talking to the dean, and she said, "Well, yeah, I mean, we are right now in one of those loops where we're looking for adjuncts, and here's this class that I'd like you to teach, but, what else are you interested in?" And I said, "Well, definitely artificial intelligence." And she said, "Well, that's something we're trying to consider." Now, this is 2+ years ago. So from a higher education standpoint, that's a little bit ahead of the curve. Like, I mean, you can go through LinkedIn now and watch a very cathartic set of posts going on amongst professors saying, like, what shall I do with AI this fall? But 2 years ago, that was a little more abnormal to be talking about. There was mostly just resistance. And so I said to the dean, I said, frankly, from my standpoint, my heart is that people just don't get run over by this. And so from an educational standpoint, we could tackle that one first.
Yeah.
I think this is incredibly challenging for this generation of students, right? And this is a generation, and the one kind of, if you think of generations as like a couple of years, not like Gen X, millennial, like, these couple generational cohorts just by a couple of years, there's been a lot of challenges. There was COVID. I don't get to go to high school. Then there's like, then I've got other challenges with just kind of the economy and like, what is this doing to my parents and where are we at with things? And, just your standard kind of transformative kind of things your average college student gets to deal with. And now they're hearing that whole parts of the job market they might be considering just aren't going to be there anymore. And the bottom rung of the ladder will be kicked out. And I'd say another thing on that, this is maybe a deeper click than I intended to get into, is that there's also kind of like who you're made to be problem. And what I mean by that is like, if you looked across all the personality profile tests, right? I think we all know that like extroversion and great communication skills, and I want to be a podcast host someday, is not equally distributed. Do you know what I mean? That's not like an equally distributed gene, right? Now, I taught public speaking while getting my master's degree, for example, and I can tell you that no public speaking professor on the planet who has a heart doesn't grade on a curve. You know, it's like being a youth sports coach. It's the same thing. I did that for a while when my kids were young. I wasn't like in it forever, but like a lot of dads, you know, you coach your kids' team or whatever. And there were kids that would enter the field and they could turn a double play, and I hadn't told them how to turn a double play. And there were other kids that the ball kept hitting them in the chest all season long, no matter how many times I told them how to catch the ball. And so, you know, there is the innate ability thing. And what I mean by that is, I think one of the things that's really creeping into these kids' minds, and it's a good thing for them to consider, and it's a good thing for you to consider as a parent, is okay, so the personality tests say that there's only so many extroverts and there's only so many people who are like super intuitive, and there's only so many people who have a sense of taste and judgment kind of innately. And then there's a whole bunch of the rest of us. Arguably, by the numbers, if you look at these personality tests, more of us who are analytic, who are driven by, like, you know, as somebody once said, I forget the guy who quoted it, but he's like, you know, managing symbols, words and code and numbers. Those are the jobs that are under threat, right? And in all those jobs, and if you look at developers, it's easily the canary in the coal mine. I tell people all the time, whether you're a developer or not, as a parent or a student, look at that industry and see what's happening to work in that industry. And everybody's like, well, we need people with judgment and decision making and the ability to manage multiple agents at a time and the ability to delegate. These skills are not equally distributed. They're not equally God-given either. They're actually some of the hardest stuff to teach people, right? In a meaningful way, right? And so I think a lot of the students are kind of recognizing that, wow, I'd really like to be, I'm just going to knock a career for a minute, but like, I don't mean it like it's all dead, but you know, I'd like to go into the bottom rung of financial planning,
Right.
says a young person, right? And I'm like, well, the bottom rung of financial planning, young person, is going to be AI. The upper level of financial planning may not be AI, because there's a big human connection there. But that bottom layer of you just doing analysis and spreadsheets all day, well, that's, I don't know if I trust that anymore as a job. And yet somebody is maybe wired to maybe do that for their whole career, right? You know, and I think that's it's a real big societal challenge. I think it's a big challenge for individuals, you know, and maybe less so for the two of us talking, because, you know, you own a podcast and I like getting on them. So I don't think the extroversion issue is really an issue, right? But, you know, but I really have a heart for, like, how do we move people and train them and do those kinds of things and steer them around careers that are going to go away. That's one other thing. And then we can take this wherever you want, because you just started talking about education. But, like, you know, if you threw a rock, there's going to be somebody that says there'll be plenty of jobs for everyone after all this is over. And somebody else will say there'll be, you know, enough money for everyone. And somebody else will say there's not enough money for anyone when it's done. And somebody else will say there'll be total job devastation. It's hard to know at this point. I mean, it's easy to write a conjecture, right? And I've got my opinions on all those things. But what I do know is there are some jobs that are going away. I mean, we don't need a lot of medical transcriptionists anymore. You know what I mean? And we don't need certain jobs. And worse yet, if we're being honest with ourselves, some of those jobs are not the most highly skilled jobs. And they might be filled with people who have incredibly meaningful lives outside of work and education. And they're not super excited to go back and get another 4-year degree, you know what I mean, in nuclear engineering or whatever, you know what I mean, to go get another job. And I don't know how we really transfer that workforce. I'm not saying everybody doesn't want to do that. I'm not trying to be disparaging. I'm just being, like, objective. Like, if you took, you know, people sometimes take jobs so they can have a life and they can contribute to their church and their community and, you know, spend time at home and all those kinds of things. Not everybody's, like, massively driven to reinvent themselves every 5 minutes, you know? And so there's a lot of interesting things here. And yet I think the university has an incredibly important role to play. If you're an AI forward university like Fox, and that's not me just raising the flag, they legitimately are in a lot of places. You not only can help train the next generation, but you can be a source of insight and inspiration and education to professionals. How we get there, how we fund all that, I don't know. I'm not a government policymaker, so that's a different.
No, that is absolutely a different problem. And as we're recording this midway through the summer of 26, there's a lot of open letters. There was one that was drafted just yesterday by, I think, 1,300 tech leaders and employees asking for more regulation, which is kind of a perverse thing. So let's put that in a pocket, though, for a moment. I think a lot of what you're really speaking to here, Sean, is the idea of pace of change. And when we talk about what we don't know, and we've all got our opinions, yeah, we do. I think the one thing that is really, really clear is that unless and until this technology plateaus its exponential increase, we are going to be confronted with a very disruptive period where the pace of change continues to accelerate and quite frankly, in unpredictable ways, right? Whether you subscribe to the idea that we've crossed the threshold into the singularity or any of that other geek speak, the point is we are confronted with a very rapidly changing situation, which makes it very difficult for employees as well as for the up and coming college students and folks in the educational system that you talked about. So I think that's kind of a grounding point in terms of how do we as a species, but then also as individuals, going back to your comments about personality tests and wiring, how do we as both a species and individuals grapple with that pace of change? Because I don't know that most folks are equipped with that type of mindset. And even those that are, quite frankly, it's exhausting. I don't know what you see with the folks that you're working with, but it's tiring.
Well, yeah, I mean, the rate of change is astronomical. And I know there's some people when they hear that. I want to, full state, you never know how old a podcast guest is. I know I don't mind saying it, right? I'm Gen X, I'm 55.
Right.
So I saw mobile, I saw
Yep.
cloud, I entered computing, I say, before color. That's what I tell people. My first computer was Hercules monochrome. So I had a computer that didn't have color. What had
Love it.
shades color, right? You know what I mean? So but a good trusty IBM 286 is what it was, right? And so so I've seen a few waves, right? And these things have similarities. They have echoes, right? Like I won't trust my data in an LLM. Okay, all right. Well, you didn't trust your data in the cloud and you didn't trust your data in a mobile device. And you were basically ultimately, and I know there's probably like a CIO that's going to freak out when I say this, but ultimately, no matter how many different compliance checks you did, and no matter how often you read their SOC report, and no matter whatever you did, ultimately, you were basing that on trust in the words.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you were doing. So if an AI provider says it won't go in the training data set and we're wigged out by that, some of that is just because we believe that AI platform is new and therefore can't be trusted, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, we did research study after research study when the cloud came out. I don't know how many we did. And it was the same progression. It was industries that didn't have a lot of compliance concerns and a lot of regulation. We all know the ones that do and the ones that don't. They were like, yippee, the cloud. I get rid of my servers. No more colo, right? Or whatever. And then the banks were like, no way. I will never put your data on a mobile. Well, until it makes us money to put money on a mobile device and sell you mobile checking and banking. And then we're more than happy to do that for you, right? So it's kind of the same. It's the same arc in some ways. And I think, one of the challenges with the speed, it's a slight counterfactual. I agree with you, right? That the velocity is crazy high compared to anything else. I mean, even if you just try to sit on the news stream, I've never taught anything out of all the technology and business topics that I've had the opportunity to teach over my career, either explicitly in a classroom setting or just as a business leader, right? Mentoring people. There's nothing that's done things like, oh, I was going to teach this thing in an hour. Now this announcement came out and I'm not going to teach it anymore. And I'm going to go teach something completely different for the next 50 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And on one level, if you like that kind of thing, well, that's kind of fun. But to your point, it's a little bit like, wow, I come back from a vacation and everything's different all of a sudden. But a counter to that also kind of agrees with you, kind of in a duality. This guy, Ethan Mollick, that I love following. And he said, this is like a couple months back. He's like, what people don't get is if this all stopped, it got no better. This is pre-Fable, by the way, just to put a benchmark. He's like, there'd be a massive amount of disruption.
Yes.
If it just stopped. And I think people just don't, they struggle with that. They struggle with that conceptually. And another reason I think people struggle to understand what's really happening here is that this generalization, like all generalizations, phrase at the edges, but if you look at what computing has done to work, historically, it's done more to, let's say, the analytical left brain tasks, right? I shall giveth you a grammar checker. I shall giveth you a spell checker. I shall give it with you a thing that calculates formulas. Anybody who's ever taught Excel to newbies, everybody knows the moment they go, ooh, pivot tables. And there's like 5 people in the room that get it, and 5 people that just like, my brain hurts. I cannot understand what just happened in that spreadsheet, right? And so, but and I understand people could point to like Adobe and like Photoshop and all this, but even those, you're driving. Like I taught some of that stuff at one point in my career. A lot of like, if dates me, macro media director, right? Go back. But the point is like, you're still in the driver's seat in a really like tangible way. And when you can just prompt an AI video that looks real, and there is no way if it scrolled past your feed, you would ever know that it's not. That's tackling a whole different set of like right brain creative, you know what I mean, things that I think really melts people's brain. They struggle with that because they haven't seen computing come after that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's kind of an answer to that, which is that I had a conversation with a student once that always stays with me. This student came up, and it was after a guest lecture I gave in somebody else's class on like AI's impact on a particular career, not the one the student ended up bringing up, but a different one. And the student said, are you okay with all this? Because, I've always felt the same whenever I teach on AI, is that I have to tell you how it's changing. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to demonstrate. It's going to be hands on the keyboard. You're going to get your hands on the keyboard. You're going to learn that way. But then we're not going to have to wonder what's actually possible. We're going to actually like see it.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, so I did a lot of that. So I'm pointing out like a lot's going to change. And the student said, are you okay with all this? And I'm like, well, one, I'm not responsible for it, but I understand where you're coming from. And I said, what do you want to go do? And the student said, well, I don't really like what AI is doing to writing. And I said, after a little bit of back and forth, I went up to the board and I drew a vertical rectangle. And I said, at the bottom of this, like all these writing tasks, you're just going to have to give up. And this is me like telling the truth before I said something sensitive, right? I'm like, I think you're going to have to give it up. I mean, if you love stringing prepositions together, that game's up. The last time I told a client this morning that I was actually training, I said, I think it's been over a year that I've actually written something from the top to the bottom. Now, we can come back to that because I know some people are like, he's not writing his stuff. I would actually argue that I am writing my stuff, but if you want to come back to that, we can have a conversation about that. But I said to this student, I said, so the bottom of your box, the routine stuff, that's going to go away. I said, but here's the question you got to ask yourself. Did you get into writing to influence people? And if you did, and that means inherently the top of your box as a writer is dotted. It's limitless. It just goes on into infinity. So you get to do more of that. You get to do a lot more of that. And we've always had a medium. We've always had a way of communicating, right? A way of getting our message out. And I'm not saying I convinced her one way or the other. That's never really necessarily my goal. I think a weird thing about AI is people go through a standard arc, especially the people who are less likely to immediately pick it up, for better or worse, is that I think they see it, they resist, they get angry. It's all the stages of grief. You know what I mean? And then eventually, and I say this somewhat tongue in cheek, I don't mean it like a jerk, they post 6 months later, well, I used AI to write something and I liked it, and that's like a super common loop that I see. And what does that mean? That means this is attacking us, and that's the right word, I think, in ways that we're not used to. We're not used to technology doing it at this speed and at these abilities that we kind of thought were uniquely human, right? And one last thing, because you just made me think about it when we talked about like personality tests and who's more affable and engaging and whatever. I think one of the challenging things is, a lot of the people that, and I mean this in a good way, like a lot of the people who are talking about AI, are natively people that like to get a message out, whether they've got a great Substack or a LinkedIn thing or a book or whatever, right? Or a YouTube channel, whatever. And that almost by definition, I think makes them a little blank on a message that's screaming, thou shalt communicate more effectively, thou shalt be more engaging, thou shalt be more human, thou shalt be connect with more people, thou shalt be more emotive. It rings kind of hollow to some people that they're like, I mean, my wife, we've got a wedding speech planned for Sunday. My wife is like, you will say all the words, honey. I will stand next to you. There is no way I am giving any of the words. I will just be in tears. There is no way I could communicate this speech. Yet she's all in. She likes all the words. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And these people put out these pronouncements of like, the future shall be taste, judgment, and great engagement skills. And it's like, but what do we do with the other part of it?
Mm-hmm.
And how do we address that?
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are some educational solutions we can talk about that, but like, and there's also professional ones. Where is that kind of training? Because the research shows to move somebody like a standard deviation on some of these skills takes a lot of intensive training. It's not just like, hey, go take a weekend seminar, from Toastmasters and all of a sudden you're really good at all this stuff, right?
Right.
I mean, it doesn't work that way. And here's the corollary. Writing's the same.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
I mean, to become a good writer, we know is a long time.
That's right.
Right. And maybe one last thing on this is that I think one of the silver linings in all of this when it comes to skill building is, and I say this to students and professionals and teams a lot too, is like, wouldn't it be a wonderful world though, if like, instead of being T-shaped, or 10,000 hour shaped or whatever thing you want to use to describe like that barber pole of skills that's you,
mm-hmm.
that you had to hone, right? Like our joke about fishing, right? I'm on the Willamette River a ton, right? The charter thing, by the way, is free. Like I just like taking people out fishing. It's not like, so if the IRS is like, wait a minute, he's running a fish. No, this is just free. I don't charge anybody, but I love to teach people to fish, right? So I've fished for smallmouth bass on that river for years. My son even said when I took my future father-in-law out, or my future, by the way, this is funny. What do you call your son's father? There is no name for that. We realized that in our family. We were like, so my other son, we were trying to say, I'm like, well, what is he to you, Ryan? It's like he's your brother's father-in-law. I'm like, that's really mouthy. I'm like, brother's father-in-law. So he's the BFL in our house. He's the BFL. And to me, he's the SFL because he's the son's father-in-law. So I took the SFL out fishing, and and my other son says, "You're nice of my son to say." He probably said it because he's in front of his father-in-law to be. But he said, you're standing in a boat on a mountain of fishing knowledge. And he looks at me and, shrugs, right? And so like, because I've fished that river for a long time. And so where am I going with that? So that's my 10,000 hours as a hobby, right? So what if we were W or M shaped? I can tell you right now, I started my career and I was probably a horrible writer. I have an objective example of it too. I came across a post. Some people might know David Maister's work. It was called Running the Professional Services Firm, right? And that's close to the title of the book. I can't remember, for some, managing the professional services firm. Anyway, so he had a website. He's long retired. Perhaps because his second major book, for some reason, was named Strategy and the Fat Smoker. I mean, of all the odd title choices to swing to after writing a perennial. So last thing here, a couple years back, probably more than that, frankly, I go bump in his website, find some article that I'd referred to somebody else, and I'm scrolling through the comment stream, and I'm like, what's that comment? I can't even really make hide nor hair of it. What is that? And you know what I realized? It was me that wrote it like 15, 20 years ago. And it was a mess. It was just a mess of a comment, right? And so I'm saying, like, I think I've become a better writer than that even without AI. And I think I can empirically prove that. But what if we were W and M shaped? What if somebody that, was really good at writing could practice public speaking with, a video and audio based AI? What if somebody that's really good at public speaking could just really get those really awesome thoughts out that they have, those creative ideas, and yet get them out in a way that is in the written word? And that's pretty cool, I think. So that's the gift we get for the things that might be destroyed, I guess.
I think that's a wonderful turn of the phrase there. That's the gift we get instead of the things that may be destroyed. And at the risk of sounding like a nodding, yes, I agree. I agree with what you're throwing out there regarding the idea of W or M shape versus the T shape. And while it's not a perfect apples to apples comparison, what occurred to me as you were going through this was the idea of transportation. And bear with me for a minute, right? When we were reliant upon horse drawn or just singular horse, I guess horse singular transportation, you, as the owner of that horse, had to understand an awful lot about how that horse worked, right? You had to understand when it was sick. You had to understand when it was time to shoe it. You had to understand how to feed it, how to care for it. But your goal wasn't to be an expert in horse. Your goal was to get to the grocery store or the corner store or to go to church or to visit your family and friends. Similarly, when the automobile came out, you had to transition your skill set to understand how to make this car work. If you go back 70 years, the shade tree mechanic is legendary. You changed your own oil. You had to understand all this stuff. The first 50 years of car versus the past 1,000 years of horse were very challenging, right? Now we're in an era where I couldn't tell you what half the stuff in my vehicle does. I don't need to. I go out, I get in the car, and I go. And that doesn't mean that we don't still need mechanics and other specialists out there. But what has really changed is the time that I would have spent being an expert in horse or an expert in car is now transferred into other things. And the barrier to my mobility has been significantly reduced, thus enabling me to do a lot that I couldn't previously do in other eras. And I think while it's an imperfect example, it speaks in some ways to what you're talking about with the W or the M. And we shouldn't be, I think, preemptively grieving for what we are about or in the process of losing, in as much as trying to understand what we are gaining, to your point. So I offer that up just as a different kind of contextualization of something similar that I think you're saying. And I think it's really important for us to keep that in mind, because just because you don't want change to happen doesn't mean it's not going to happen. We don't have a choice.
No, I agree with that. And it's a good touchstone because, my other son, the one not getting married this weekend, he races spec Miatas. And if anybody knows anything about that, it's a great, easy racing league to get into. You can go buy a used spec Miata for like 10K-ish, at least the starter car. And you can become a race car driver and you can go run around in a field of 50 cars on a big race and have a lot of fun. And he's really good at it. He's also a mechanic. He got a certificate, 2-year degree to do that. He's taught me things. Like, I'm like you, cars started to rapidly go beyond like your average person's ability to kind of deal with all the computers and the electronics and batteries. But, we have a older NB Miata, like a 2005, and it's like Mater from Cars. Like, there's very little electronic in there. You know what I mean? Like, everything is just a hand reach, take the oil filter off, remove this, you know what I mean? Away. And yeah, and we're going to need some of that. Like I tell students, if you want to be the saddle maker in your domain, that's fine. Like there's one saddle maker I know of in this little town called Malala that's not far from where I live in Oregon City. And I don't remember driving by any other ones, but this is Oregon. Oregon City is literally where one of the two places in Oregon where the Oregon Trail ended. Like, that video game some of us played in grammar school, like we are the end of it. Like, literally it's at the end of my, about 10 miles from me. And so, I imagine there was lots of saddle makers in Oregon City when it, you know what I mean? And now we have, as far as I know, one, and it's not even in Oregon City. So, and there are meaningful things to ask ourselves. There's somebody else, another student, actually kind of a friend of the family, a friend of some of the kids, and this student is into photography, and this particular individual is into photography when it comes to racing. And now I would argue that in that domain, you don't really want a lot of AI. I mean, we joke about it, me and her sometimes. I'll be like, well, the mountain wasn't out beyond the racetrack. You sure you just don't want to add it back in? You know what I mean today, right? Yeah. And she's like, no, I only wanted my photo, what was in my photo, right? And so I do think we got to keep that part real, I mean, if you're asking somebody to write poetry from the heart about their personal lived experience, but that's another interesting one. This may be off topic, but I'll make this quick. But like, one of the things that happened last semester that was fun is the advent of AI music in a classroom setting, right?
Yeah.
And so I had a really particular interesting conversation. George Fox is a Christian university. So just to mention that, because this ties into what I'm going to say real briefly, is that there was some good discussion amongst the students about like, okay, well, I don't believe this is truly inspired music. I don't believe, it's inspired by kind of the spark of faith, etc. I'm not necessarily agreeing or disagreeing with that student perspective, but what I came up with was I said, okay, well, here is a Christian music artist. It's AI music. What do you all think about it? I played it, and there was kind of a general, I don't really like this. So then I said, okay, well, what if I told you this? What if I told you this person is of faith and they're really good at writing poetry, but they don't happen to know music and they don't know how to make instruments, and the lyrics to this are awesome if you actually check it out. And so she used AI to fix a deficiency when it came to music, and the song is now popular on the playlist, on the charts. Those are the conversations we're going to have, and they're going to be across every domain, right?
That's right.
Science and programming and development and leadership, right?
Yes.
I mean, you see all the snarky stuff about CEOs should be replaced by AI, right? You know what I mean? There's a great parody site. I don't know it off the top of my head right now. I'm going to put it, it'll probably show up in my newsletter this week. That's not a ping for that. I just remembered I'll probably put it in it. But there's a site that's one of those parody, hire our AIs to replace your CEO. But what makes the site sing is there's all this ROI language on it. You know what I mean? About your CEO costs this, enter the cost of your CEO, the cost of tokens to replace him. You know what I mean? It's kind of a fun, goofy little thing. But we're going to wrestle with a lot of this stuff.
Absolutely.
And we're not going to get away from it.
Well, and I think what I'll use a different phrase. I'll say it's skill extension. I think that's what you're talking about here when you give the example about that music. And that's where I think a lot of folks are lacking imagination because we haven't seen it made real for us in enough different ways yet. But that is a way to extend your skills to get the result. It's like that old parable about, well, why does somebody buy a drill at Home Depot, right? Level one is they want a hole in the wall. No, they don't want a hole. Level two is they want a hanger on the wall. Okay, why do they want a hanger? They want to put a picture on the hanger, right? And then eventually we get to the point where they don't actually want any of that. They want to be reminded of the good times they had on the Willamette River fishing with SFL, right?
Right.
Yeah. So we just got to get to that point where we understand that the result in many ways matters more than some of the intermediary steps, but not always, right? It's a nuanced caveat. Like you mentioned earlier, when you gave the example about the top of the box and the bottom of the box, a lot of the stuff from the bottom of the box can go away because that's now table stakes. Yet the top of the box is still extremely relevant, and putting the work in to understand how to be good at that top of the box so that you can get the result that you want. That's what really matters.
Well, and on that point, I had somebody, a couple quick things. One, I agree. Imagination, if I said, what are some of the skills that really I can recognize will lead to someone being very effective in using AI and using it meaningfully? Imagination, and back to our personality test, that's not equally distributed, right? In terms of our ability to imagine creatively, but that's a big one. The other one is delegation. But the thing you mentioned just literally came up in a training session I ran this morning. Is somebody asked me in a corp, they said, how do we know if all this spending is right? It was kind of a frustrated, how do I know? If I go build a bunch, I'm going to generalize a bit so it's not super clear what they were trying to build. But if I create a bunch of agents and they're for a bunch of sellers and we're from this kind of team, I'll leave that part vague, and how do I know that they just don't waste tokens and whatever? And I said, well, look, there's a lot of potential answers to that. But one of the biggest ones is, what was the outcomes those sellers were measured by? And if ultimately the major variable that you have changed in that quarter, you haven't changed their comp and you haven't changed 1,000 other things, and the competitive dynamic, it goes up and down in selling, but it hasn't changed dramatically, and your products are still roughly, the same level of competitiveness they were before and whatever, well, take a pilot group, give them access to whatever infrastructure you've decided to build, authorize, or kind of give them available in an ad hoc way, and figure out if the outcomes change, and in a way I recognized, I could tell that was like an unsatisfactory answer, but I think it's the right answer, because that's what this is. It's meaningful AI use changes the job. It changes the box, and it changes it in some cases dramatically. So then it is change management, and it's a leadership initiative, and it's a monitoring initiative. If anything else came in, and change the job as much as AI can and should, you would bring in all the change management philosophy you could think of and all of the thinking, right? And the hang up is a lack of imagination in recognizing, to your point, that it's a massive job changing kind of exercise. And it's not just another CRM. It's not just another marketing automation tool. It's not just kind of a slightly more buff Outlook. You know what I mean? That's not what it is.
Clippy
right?
on steroids.
Right,
Yes.
right. It's not that. It's not that. Right? Buffy with bigger shoulders. I mean, Clippy
right.
with bigger shoulders, right? You know what I mean? It's not that. It's you have to reimagine the job. And the teams, to kind of segue slightly into like the business side of it, I think it's the teams that really start to say, what should this job look like when it's AI enabled? What do we give away? What do we not do? Like, if you can't look back after you used AI in a job role for X amount of time and say, I no longer do this thing, I have given it to my AI companion, maybe monitored, maybe goal set. I mean, I get that. But if you can't meaningfully say, I as a human don't do this thing anymore, you have either not been imaginative enough, so go find somebody who is, or secondly, you haven't meaningfully delegated enough. You haven't done it effectively. Because teams that really succeed, they can look back and they can see that. A side note, though, I'll say, like, it's a message to leadership. Try not to be tone deaf when you recognize this, though, because I don't know how many YouTube videos I've seen now or X posts or whatever, right? Where somebody's like, we have rolled out AI. We have removed at least 2,600 people from this building due to AI. I am so happy. Things are more productive. Our bottom line is great. When I go on the earnings call, people love me, and I'm like, okay, these are people's lives, man. And I get you can't keep them all. Like, my students ask that. They'll be like, it starts every semester the same way. I don't, some of them will say, like, I don't really like what's about to happen. I think companies should keep everybody. And I'm like, oh, Padawan, I like you as a student, but let's really talk about competitive dynamic and what happens when something allows you to create the same thing for half.
Exactly.
Right. And all of that stuff, right? Does it mean we shouldn't try? But I will say there's a massive amount of tone deafness coming from these execs. And yet I kind of get it, because I'm like, I see it in my own business. I know stuff that we do way faster than we used to be. But I think I've prevented myself from turning around and going, wow, that's amazing. You don't get to do that anymore. I'm so excited. Like, you don't work on that thing anymore. And then just stop. Because the employee goes, well, one, was all the things I did? And two, if you take away all my things, do I get a job? And like, is that the goal? And it's like, no. That's where we go back to outcomes, where you got to turn that conversation back and say, I'd like to keep all 26 of you marketers, actually. You know what I mean? But let's talk about agency and outcomes and what do we really get to do? But what is that? But job reimagining. That's redesigning the job.
And this comes up a lot, both in consultations as well as previously on the show, is we are not equipped, and by equipped, I mean trained or acculturated, to understand how to look at our own jobs top down, break them into pieces, figure out what the workflow looks like, figure out what could be handed maybe to an agent or an AI automation sequence. And this is just not something that people have been asked to do or equipped or trained to do in the past. And I know from our prior call and conversation that this is something that comes up an awful lot in your work. And I wanted to pause here because you talked about this at the beginning of your comments a few moments ago. And I think that this is something that folks need to understand when we're talking about the outputs and getting to those outputs. Your job is not all of these tasks. Your job is, again, the output. And do you understand how to segment your role? How do you understand how to figure out what that workflow looks like? So when you work with companies, when you work with the people that we're trying to preserve, not just their task, but more importantly, their livelihood, when you work with them to pick apart their jobs and understand the process from the top down, what does that actually look like? Do you have any examples of maybe a real role or a real person? Yeah, take that apart for me.
Yeah. I mean, like I'll get into a real role in a sec, but like, I think, one thing to mention, this is a place where maybe the imaginative person can pair up well with the analytic, because the imaginative person might intuit that there is a part of this that can be handed to AI, but they may not be the person to look down upon their job and actually break it up into shards, decide what segment can be meaningfully boxed in, given to an AI in an enclosed loop, and basically, audited, maintained, and like run forevermore on that stack, right? And there's a good partnership there. But I'd say the first step is good delegation to an AI is a lot like delegating to a human. It's right at the front of the book I wrote, and I mean I love it that people like the book. Like that's always cool. Like who doesn't like that? But here's the key thing. I'm still a little surprised they like that part. Does that make sense? Like I'm still a little surprised that that's one of the parts they like. So don't feel bad if you like it and you ever go get it. But like I'm like, and maybe that's because you're pairing up different personality types. That was one of the first things I stumbled into. I was like, it feels like, and maybe that's because I owned a business and I delegated a lot in my life, right? That it's the same contextual frame, right? I have to give context, to give background context to delegate well. You don't just go up to an employee and say like, go do this. You don't say get on a plane and go sell Oklahoma. You say like, here's our history. Here's what we have for sales. Here's what's on the truck, as people used to say, right? Here's basically what we've got to offer. Here's the competitive landscape. You preload all that context. And then you set bounds. You're like, okay, I need you to sell at least this much. You know what I mean? Be great if you sold this much. Then there's an accelerant. When you report back to me about your sales, this is the format upon which you have to report back. No chicken scratch. You actually have to like give me something I can use to generate a PO and an order and all this other stuff, right? A seller's nightmare. I sold it. Wait, there's paperwork, right? You know what I mean? All of that has to happen, right? And we give guardrails and we give exemplars. We're like, hey, these are the proposal formats that we use. We do all of that. And what happens so often with AI is people go up and say, write me a proposal.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And they're trained, I think, from a search engine mentality. That's where they come from. And here's another thing, for those who might say, I don't work that way and I don't really do that. Again, the future's here, but it's not equally distributed. I just trained a group this morning. Incredibly smart people. They work in a technology company. Some of them are still just slinging basic prompts. You know what I mean? Like this is not, there's a guy that put up a post that I read at the end of it. Actually, I think I might have closed it. Oh, well, that's a bummer. But the guy said, he was talking about his own company and he's a CEO. And he said, to those of us who have wired and delegated, I'm paraphrasing, so much of our life to AI, it seems like magic to everybody else. And it seems almost untrustworthy. You know what I mean? Like this, so like, I'll give you an example of like job role imagining specifically, like, cause we do a lot of research in the tech sector. So some of the teams I'll talk to are research oriented, and I can give you examples from marketing in a minute and sales, but research, it's a classic thing to monitor the existing environment, to go look at competitors, to look at pricing, to go look at recent announcements, to read earnings calls, to synthesize through that. It's a constant thing to go talk to wins and losses and do maybe bespoke research on new customer segments and have conversations. And it's common to go run quantitative surveys and then basically do that analysis, crosstabs, pivot tables, all the way down to max diff, depending on how complex you want to get and what the data set is. In our workflow, all the quant analysis we feed through an AI. And I should say for any client that's listening, appropriately, and if you don't want us to, we've always said no, we'll go take it out of it and we won't do it. But all those things aside, right? We've grown to trust it. Nobody does quantitative like crosstabs around here anymore. Nobody does that. Qualitative analysis, a lot of times we use Gemini Notebook. We used to pay for a third-party tool called Coloop. Really nice guys. I like the Coloop guys. But we're the classic story of one of the main frontier models decides to launch something that basically just eats the SaaS that we were paying for. And we're like, why am I going to pay that much a month? So all the qualitative analysis is done that way. On top of it, like any of the routine market scanning that like an internal team might do, that should just be handed out. Or in a conversation I had with somebody the other day, right? They're like, what I want to go take, like the go-to-market engineer, which is a role now, right? Which is a very AI-enabled role. Like I was talking to a client, they've got the classic hit list they want to go after, but it's like an ICP, and they go into Sales Navigator, and they go look for all that, but then they don't have the emails. And so how do they correlate that? Well, the answer there is Clay, which is a very AI empowered tool, right? Which can enrich a data set and it goes ahead and pulls and can even go write all the emails that you want. From a sales example, there's even a personal one. Like the other day, I use Superhuman as my email client. I can wax poetically about Superhuman, by the way. I've used it for years, but not super happy they got bought by Grammarly, but that's a separate point. Well, it's an MCP connector now. So I had a list of people that had downloaded an asset of ours, and I was like, I feel like I should reach out to them about an update to the book. And, instead of the normal way of doing that, a variety of ways I could, I was like, I'm going to just feed all that to Claude. I'm going to say, here's the list. I want you to sort it for me based on the ICPs that we feel we should target as an organization. I want you to draft emails in my voice with my writing skill. And I want you to actually, I have a skill that declaudifies it. So it doesn't say like, the quiet part should be said out loud, doesn't start every sentence, right? You know what I mean? Which is the easiest tell on the planet. Right.
Oh yeah.
And so I get all that out of there. And then I said, go ahead and drop those drafts in Superhuman. So they're all ready for me to send and they're ready just sitting there and I can personalize them however I want. All that's routine, but I could tell you like not that long ago, that was all manual. That was my Thursday afternoon and my Friday.
That's right.
And marketing's the same, there's so much meaningful content creation and asterisk on, say the quiet part out loud, not meaningful content creation, but there's so much meaningful content creation if appropriately trained, right? Or even on the data analytics side, there's a client I'm talking to that's like, hey, we have all this data from all of our dashboards and we need to justify basically the inbound spend and what we're doing with it from a marketing standpoint and all the classic marketing things. And they just can't get to it because they can't synthesize it. They don't have the time to go do that data analytics work. And well, now you can go ahead and do that. And it's just across job after job after job. And the same thing at the university too. It's like different classes we teach, have different levels of AI water in it in terms of how that job is being transformed and what tasks can be meaningfully given away. But I would say it does all come back to enough imagination to consider the possibility. And the ability to delegate meaningfully so that you get the response back you want and that it's a safe one. And maybe a third one that I don't always say, I guess, which is like, and it gets at what you were talking about, like an openness to embrace the churn. Because once you step down reimagining those job roles, you may be on that crazy train for, well, a long while. Right.
That's right.
And that's a full-time job. And one other thing I want to say on this like reimagining thing is kind of tip wise is I don't know if you saw Atlassian's report that came out about what they did with job force. Okay. Super cool report. Came out about a week ago. And they basically detail how they changed job roles in the company because of AI. It's a super powerful report, but here's the first point in the executive summary. Make the AI rollout a C-suite initiative, not an IT one.
Oh yeah.
And that is honestly one of the biggest mistakes I see in every org that I talk to.
Well, you put IT in charge of this. Yeah, that's where the initiative goes to die.
Exactly, because immediately they're talking about compliance and security and the choice of a single model and all this other stuff. And again, I talked to lots of IT guys over the years. I like IT guys. I mean, we've interviewed, I don't know how many of them over the last 20 years, right? They're great people. But if you have a technology that is going to reimagine the work, the people who need to be in charge are the business leaders. They need to be informed by IT so they don't go crazy. And the other thing the Atlassian report nails, which I thought was great, they're like, this whole single model thing is phooey. They're like, the productivity we get from giving multiple models once secured and that are tailored to the individual for 20, 30, 40 bucks a month, whatever, is like massively overweight. But they're like, but these things have to be there, right? And anyway, so that it's a really great report. If somebody hasn't looked at it, I would highly recommend it.
I have not looked at that report. I'm definitely going to check that out. I think the other piece that comes out from what you're talking about there is when we talk about all of the ways that work is getting reimagined and reinvented. I don't think there's an appreciation for folks that when you leverage these different tools, you're essentially building a team around you. And I don't see a lot of people thinking about it that way. I still see a lot of star performers out there that either say, do this, do that with their team members, their human team members, or they're just like, head down, I'm the rock star. I'm going to, soup to nuts. I'm going to crunch this out. But you've got the benefit now of, as we said earlier, skill extension, but you've also got the ability to get the feedback and to get better outputs in a faster manner than you would if you were working individually. And I feel like that gets missed an awful lot. And that's really a lot of what you were speaking to just now, too.
Yeah, it does, and so much so that I'm looking forward to teaching it, because it's the first time I've ever taught anything exactly like this, and it's the first time. It's always dangerous when you say what I'm about to say. To my knowledge, a course like this doesn't exist. So if anybody out there is like, I know one, feel free to email me.
There'll be one online tomorrow morning.
I want it right. I want to know. Okay. But to my knowledge, when I looked out at MBA level courses, because I'm teaching in the MBA program as well this year, I'm the AI integration lead for the MBA program at Fox. And so I'm teaching there, and I said, the course I want to teach is I want to teach entrepreneurship with just you and AI. How far can you get with just you and AI? And I always feel slightly awkward even bringing it up because I love my employees. So I don't mean anything against the employees I have, right? You know what I mean? But I'm like, okay, if I could jump all the way back to the beginning, how far could I get before I needed an employee? For example, writing. I hired an ex-journalist. I used to joke that her nickname was Half As Long from the movie A River Runs Through It. You sound like you know what that is. We won't unpack it. If people know what that scene is, go look it up. It has a lot to do with writing. Okay. But the point is, I used to nickname her Half As Long because everything I sent her, she basically told me could be half as long.
Yeah. Right.
And I needed her. I actually gave it as a what's that Christmas thing where you give a gag gift? I forget anyway, I can't remember.
Like the Secret Santa kind of deal.
Yeah, exactly. So actually the thing I gave her was a copy of the movie River Runs Through. It was really funny because she was a millennial. So I don't think she's ever going to watch it. You know what I mean? But she was
did you give it to her on VHS?
I should have actually. No, it was a DVD, but that's close enough. Right. So anyway, do I need half as long now? Probably not in the beginning stages, right? Do I eventually need a marketer? Yes, absolutely. Because as it scales, I need that, right? But for my personal writing, as the principal who's trying to get thoughts out, well, I don't know where is that line. So the course I'm teaching is that, and it's weird because when I looked around, I could find a lot of entrepreneurship courses that were like, let me teach you all about LLMs and ML. Kind of like the CS department decided to have an MBA course, right? And then there was a whole bunch of entrepreneurship courses that were like, let's talk about AI governance and strategy for AI deployment. And that's great. I'm not dissing that at all. We have that in our MBA program too. But I couldn't really clearly find this lane that you hit, which is like, how far could I go if I birthed the company today with AI? Like, when is the first time I need an employee? And what does that employee look like when I do? Right? What exactly is that employee? Is that a singular role employee? You could argue maybe not. Maybe they're just a great orchestrator and they're a great delegator, right? I mean, there's all these kind of interesting questions of what the shape of a company looks like. It reminds me, although it was much less of an impact than what we're talking about here, but it reminded me of like when we did research when cloud adoption was accelerating. There was some research we did around companies that their born on date, as we said, was after the major clouds had taken off, right? And the major cloud-based email and cloud-based calendar and cloud-based services had come off, because those companies that were their born on date was after the cloud. They operated very differently internally from like an IT stack because they just simply trusted the cloud. They were born after it. So they had this kind of like first mover advantage. And I think we're going to see, all the way back to the beginning, I think we're going to see young people build some really amazing companies because they to them, this is just substrate. That's what it is. And that I'm really excited to see what the students build during the course, actually. Because, I too kind of wonder what it would have been like if I started a new venture now, and what my decisions would be and where I would put things. So it's a super, super interesting point to think about.
Well, it is, and it harkens back to that bet that's been running in Silicon Valley for many, many years about the first $1 billion company with 0 employees, right? So we'll see where that goes. And I agree with you. It's a fascinating, not just a thought experiment. It's an experiment that's going to play out in real time that we're going to get to see. You said something there too that I think harken back to a previous thread of conversation, and it brought it home for me in a way that I hadn't quite thought about before. But it was this idea of what I don't need to have in my skill set anymore. And here's what really crystallized for me. And I work with a lot of companies, and we talk about the power of the transformative tech and how you can leverage it in different ways. And one way that I think is underappreciated, since we were talking about writing earlier, is the idea of oral communication or verbal communication versus written communication. I have met a lot of people that are very intelligent that despite their best efforts, they can't write very well, right? Doesn't mean they can't think clearly and they don't have great ideas, but they can't write very well. And I think the transcription tools and the oral capture that's out there right now allows those folks to get their thoughts out, to diagram them, and to have an editor, whether it's a human or an AI, help them architect them into a different format, because we've placed so much emphasis on the written medium in the past. Even throughout this conversation, we keep coming back to it. And I'm not sure that that emphasis has to be there anymore. I think the critical thinking skills, the ideation, the ability to articulate either in writing or verbally, those are now almost equivalent, because the verbal is no longer ephemeral. Once you speak it, it's no longer gone.
Yeah, there's so much under what you just said. So I'll try to hit a couple different things, but it's a really good point. Is like, one, my favorite story about writing, outside of knocking my own writing from 20 years ago, is that during COVID, this guy says, and he wasn't being a jerk, but he was being direct. It was in the throes of COVID. We happen to live in a state, for better or worse, I'm not making a judgment call, where it was really slammed down, like nobody could go anywhere. And our client base was kind of similar. And so it was in the midst of, everybody not going anywhere. And the client said to me, I had no idea how dumb my colleagues were until they had to write me to ask me to do things. And which stays with me to this day. Because I'm like, yeah, it's not like, hey, Bob, I think we could, reading human reactions, can we really, you want to give me a raise? Like that's very different than trying to write someone to ask for a raise or a promotion or an initiative or a new investment or just even like a proposal, right? And so there are a lot of things in what you're getting at. Like, one, it's kind of funny, right? I say something again that's a generalization, so it's risky, but you could almost predict what we're going to be dealing with was going to happen, because we put the sum of human knowledge in a written form on this thing called the internet. And eventually computing got to the point that it could suck it all down, which is AI's original sin. Anybody who's been in AI long enough knows that, that they're never going to really pay for that. They're only going to pay somewhat for that because the productivity benefit outweighs it, which is a conversation we have a lot in the classroom, because they're like, but they stole it all. And I'm like, I'm not entirely disagreeing with you. I'm just telling you that it's never going to be adjudicated the way you might want. You know what I mean? It's just not going to happen. And so, and maybe even I'm a little dismayed about that, but it is what it is. And so, anyway, the point is, we did all that only so that we could make writing less of a unique skill. You know what I mean? And at the same time, the other force, though, is like, what a great equity lever, to your point, not just for like creative ideas and entrepreneurial ideas, but voices, communities, right? People who, learning how to write well was hard, and maybe circumstances were part of it. Maybe it was, just innate ability. I mean, I could blame bumping between 6 different grammar schools as we floated around schools from K through 6. I don't blame doing that, by the way. I could have learned to write at some point if I really wanted to, but like, in a meaningful way. But there are structural things that prevent you from learning a skill sometimes. And so I want to hear those voices. I do. I want to hear them. And you're absolutely right that things like whisper flow and monologue and all of these are game changers, because the reality is we speak faster than we type. Now, some of us might like writing as a way of organizing our thoughts. And by the way, there's a tyranny in the academic community. And I hate to call it a tyranny, but it is a tyranny, where there's certain people that will say, and I'm not specifically talking about Fox. I don't know if I've had an argument with anybody in the English department about this, but I imagine there's people in the English department that would feel this way in all schools. The act of writing is an act of thinking through what is full of meaning and your thought process. And I'm like, yeah, well, so is a piece of chalk. So is walking around with your Labrador. I mean, so is like talking out loud to your spouse. Like, so is, you know what I mean? It's not that the act of stringing prepositions together was the best way to generate a new idea. It was just exactly to your point. It was the medium since the printing press.
Yes.
That it was the easiest to distribute at scale with structure and impact. Right? And yet we're living it right now. Podcasts, YouTube, everything else. There clearly verbal communication can impact people in meaningful ways, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a transcript for that to work, right? So it is really a whole interesting bubble of ideas. Honestly, and back to a callback, I guess, to something I said earlier was, about me not writing something top to bottom. There's a professor that calls that distant writing. It's a great phrase, because he's like, you're still directing the writing.
Mm-hmm.
You are. And you're probably getting more out that's more meaningful, that's more on point. Again, if you don't have the, catchphrases, and all that stuff, right?
Right.
ChatGPT's is however, comma, you know what I mean? Like there's, if you don't have all that stuff and you've actually bothered, which weirdly enough is, again, delegation and mentoring. Because if anybody's had a ghostwriter or a half as long working for them, you know what I mean? They've worked with that person to get the voice lined up right, and one marketing team example. There's a very, very well-known PC computer brand, let's say. And they do other stuff, but just PCs are one of the things they do. And I talked to somebody that I worked with on and off a long time over the years, and they said, yeah, we used to hire ghostwriters to write in the voice of the CTO. We don't anymore. We just trained an AI to do it. And now every post comes out bang on and sounds just like the CTO. So that ties together, I think, the idea of like, the way we delegated to that ghostwriter, we can delegate to an AI, but you have to have the imagination, the openness, and the structure to do that. And at that point, you have reimagined some of that job. There's a whole part of the process that just runs like a flywheel. And we can argue that should have stayed bespoke, like our, family friend that's a photographer. But and in certain circumstances, that may be true. A heartfelt letter from the CEO about a hurricane running over some part of the infrastructure and hurting people. I don't want AI to write that. I want the CEO to sit down and struggle with the writing. And if they don't know how to string prepositions together and write an active voice, they can go phone a friend and they can figure out how to do that. You know what I mean? But but yeah, I mean, there's all these kind of interesting questions we're going to face about, like, what does it mean to create and to participate? And what does it mean to have a certain job structure? And it takes us all the way back to, this is a big deal.
Yeah, it is. Well, and the questions that you're raising, I think, are super critical. And so I want to make kind of a statement to that effect, and then ask you a final question, because we're running into our time block here, and an hour goes very quickly on this show. But the statement is this: I see an awful lot of generational pushback about AI, especially from the sub 25-year-old crowd. And I've got 4 of them in my house, candidly. So I get it. I hear it all the time. And I think the conversations that you're having with your students, they really matter, because you cannot put your head in the sand. You cannot just say, oh, AI bad, and walk away. So first of all, I commend you for the level of engagement with your students that you're having, because they need to be exposed to these ideas. They need to be challenged and pushed, not because their position is wrong, but because I think it doesn't serve them well in the long run. And so that level of engagement and conversation is really important. And that brings me to my final question for you here. What advice would you leave younger folks or people in the workforce that are, younger than us, let's say, about AI, about all this? I know during our prep call, one of your recommendations was keep talking to your kids about this topic constantly. Don't assume that the trades are safe, right? Get good at debating, things like that. Where should we leave people today with our conversation about a good advice point? What do you recommend? What would you like your parting thoughts to be here today?
Um, I'm going to start with something that I could end with, but I don't want to forget it. And then we'll get into some other things.
Yeah.
It's honestly my biggest piece of advice to almost anybody. And it's probably super critical with this piece. Read stuff you disagree with.
Love it.
I mean, read stuff you disagree with. You do not have to agree with it in the end. But for the love of God, read stuff end to end that you disagree with. Or if you have to, have an AI summarize it at least. But at a minimum, like engage with it. And to that point on debate, I include a debate component in the AI courses I teach. Now, historically, debate is not a course in the business school curriculum. I could argue that may change. There's a guy, Stephen Bouchard, or Bouchard, I forget. And he talks about this all the time. It's one of those weird things where I get intellectual credit for thinking about incorporating in my debate in my classes before I met Stephen Bouchard on the internet in his Substack. But he's been talking about it longer than me. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So I feel like it's like I get credit for thinking it up myself, but he honestly is probably a better authority on it. And it's important to the class because, I ask every semester and we debate meaningful things like this original sin that we talked about earlier, right? We talk about UBI as a potential solution. We talk about like all, a whole raft of things that we could have got into, but even the stuff we did. And like in an organization, who's responsible for retraining the employees themselves or the actual employer, and to what degree, and all this stuff. If I ask students how often they have engaged in a debate in their academic career in front of the classroom on a meaningful topic, every semester so far, it's been no more than 2 students, which frightens me. So I would say, to tie it into pieces, the thing you brought up, debate with your kids. Mm-hmm. Nicely, dad, mom, nicely. Listen to them. Read stuff you disagree with. Listen to stuff you disagree with. Listen to it fully. And then with your own wisdom, say, not I've been there before and this is the same. We all know that falls somewhat on deaf ears, right? It's more like, let's really engage with this. Like, for example, if you have access to one of those AIs, or maybe go buy one of those models for $20 a month for your kid. I'm not like getting reseller value from Claude, but like say, don't say use this to cheat on your homework or whatever, but like say, like, look, imagine what job you're going to go do. Ask Claude to go do that job. You know what I mean? What does Claude think? Or what does, ChatGPT think? Have them, because hands on a keyboard, I find for young people, destroys and creates an equal measure with AI. I don't teach every week that I teach. There's a structured lab, almost like it's a computer science class, but not, where they're actually building stuff with AI. And every time it's kind of the same, right? Somebody who's a little resistant will build and build and build and build and build through the semester. And I'm not saying they fall in love with AI. That's not my goal. But they recognize what it can actually do. Mm-hmm. And that's the place I would say you need to get with your kids. They have to understand what it can actually do. They can't just be like, it always says, let me say the quiet part out loud. I'll always be able to tell when it's AI. No, you won't always be able to tell.
That's right.
Just like we used to believe a video that was AI generated, we'd always be able to know. Right. And so I think that's the key thing. And that all just comes down to engaging with stuff that's contrary. And, the last thing on the career thing really fast is like find careers where the top of the box is dotted. There's a longer conversation we could have on this point, but the short version is, look at the level of agency you have. like that ultimate agency. Like what does this job allow you to impact? And even as young people, those jobs do exist. And if you can't find it, well, think about that entrepreneur point, because you're going to live in a world where you can build things and create things that, frankly, us Gen Xers want to see. I want to see you go build cool things. I don't have plans for world domination. I don't need to do everything on planet Earth. I want to see what you come up with, right? So like go do that and inspire your kids to do that. And I think that's and last thing, very, very last thing I'd say is, they're right to be a little scared. So keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say they are, but there are meaningful paths forward, and you just need help show them the way, and they need to find it themselves. But thanks for having me on, man. This was great.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. I enjoyed our conversation, and I think there was a lot of value here. And to that end, for anybody that wants to learn more about you or your work, your book, get in touch, what's the best way for them to do that, Sean?
Well, you can look me up on LinkedIn. And the fastest way is probably just Sean Campbell and then pop in Cascade Insights. On Google, I think I'm like now the 6th link. There used to be a hockey player above me. He's no longer above me, but I think I'm on page 1. I think I am still, but who knows these days. So I think you can find me that way. And then the book is available through our website. You can also just email me at sean@cascadeinsights.com. And I'm happy to talk about Cascade, or if you're just interested in even if a listener's like, hey, I just want to pick your brain about, kids and school and AI and careers, I'm always happy to talk about that too. So, but yeah, that's how folks can find me.
And is there a secret code if they want to retain you for fishing guide?
Say, I'd like to learn fishing. That's
Okay.
it. Then you're done. Then we're all set. And probably you have to live close enough. That would be the
Beautiful. Thanks, Sean. I appreciate your time today. This was great. So
thanks, man.
And thank you to our listeners out there. I appreciate you once again tuning into AI for the C-Suite. If you liked what you heard, subscribe wherever you get your pod on, follow us on LinkedIn, and check out AIforthec-suite.com. As always, until we get together next time, keep your algorithms running, your leadership evolving, and your AI in check. Take care, everybody.